Thank you, Lieutenant Governor, and thank you all for having me. I'm honored to be the president of our University of Alaska system and represent our 3 universities across the state. And thank you, Governor, for inviting us to be part of this second of many to come energy symposiums. This morning, Ambassador Emanuel shared the fact that Alaska is a strategic asset. He called it a strategic tool. I'm going to change it to a strategic asset for the U.S. For the U.S.'s national security, its energy transition. And as we push towards a net zero economy, we also have to be the nation's asset for the critical and rare earth elements that exist here in our state. By extension, the University of Alaska system is also a strategic asset for these things. Whether it's the Alaska Center for Energy and Power at UAF and its alternative energy resources and its support of the Alaska Energy Authority and the most recent Energy Task Force, or if it's our agricultural school on beginning to advance food security in Alaska, or if it's our geology programs and our mining engineering programs and petroleum engineering programs, or our Arctic research. University of Alaska Fairbanks is the world leader in Arctic research based on who uses our research to extend future research. In Alaska, we are small, okay? 750,000 on a good day, number of people. Everything we do, we have to do together. That's industry, that's the state, that's the university, that's communities. How we really move agendas is because we've come together. And the sustainable energy is something we've all embraced. Food security, which is the topic of our next speaker, is something over time we've lost as a state. And recently, as last fall, the governor actually called together a group on food security to talk about how do we become more food secure in our state. Well, it's not going to happen with just the university. It's not going to happen just with the state. It's going to take industry. It's going to take communities. It's going to take policy change. And we very much look forward to that. And I think the wisdom that our next speaker is going to bring will help us leapfrog technologies, do agriculture different, do food security different, given the new tools we have. And so as we talk about sustainable energy and the need for energy and food security together, and they're linked, and the research that we conduct, how does Alaska become a global leader? And that's what we're going to ask our keynote speaker this afternoon to talk about. He's a perfect person to provide the insight into that intersection of energy and food security. Ambassador Kip Tom is a family farmer. I asked him earlier today. I said, how do you want to be introduced? He says, I want to be introduced as a farmer. Well, we'll introduce him as an agribusiness leader who is internationally recognized. He can explain global agribusiness trends from the corporate boardroom to a family farmer, and I want to say to Alaskans. Okay, I don't know about you, but I raised my kids here in Alaska. I grew up in Montana. Family farm was nothing new to me. We were driving down the highway one time when we went to visit my mom and dad, and my son, who was like 3, looked out and there was all these things in the field. And he said, "What are those?" It was just a bunch of cows. And I didn't think about it. He'd never seen a field of cows in his memory. And of course he would ask. And so you talk about talking about agribusiness at the corporate level or at the farmer level. You're talking about agribusiness on Alaska level. But we also have to think about, in Alaska, food security is very different than farming. It's our fish. It's our moose. It's our caribou. And we don't want to forget that. It's a big part of who we are. So Kip Tom, Ambassador Kip Tom, has served as U.S. Ambassador to Rome. He brought the realities of production, agriculture, and food systems to a multilateral policy arena. And although everything, when you're talking about multiple countries, happens slow, over the past year, the Rome-based UN agency that he influenced has effectively acted at lightning speed in a variety of areas, from pandemic response, governance and resource stewardship, focused on reforms, and improved agility to face the future. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Kip Tom to our stage.
Pat, thank you for that kind introduction. I'm not usually being referred to as someone with wisdom. That's something I usually defer to my father or my grandfather when we talked about wisdom, so hopefully the age isn't showing up with me that much yet. So again, I want to thank Governor Dunleavy, Lieutenant Governor Dahlstrom, and I knew Andrew, he was here somewhere, all the work he put into this, and others in the room as well. And a special thanks to Ellie Rubenstein. She's actually the one that got me started on this pathway, working with the governor a little bit on food security in the state of Alaska. So if you haven't met Ellie, you probably will sometime today. And if you haven't, she's probably already got a network figured out for people you to meet to come up with a deal. So Ellie, I hope you get around the room and meet some people today. So some of you are probably looking at the slide or the tent card on your table. You said to yourself, I don't see food here anywhere. I just see energy. So am I at the right conference or not? So I can tell you, when we consider food and we consider energy, the two go together. You can't have food without energy, and there wouldn't be any need for energy without food. So the reality is the two do go together. Again, thank you for having us here today. You know, oftentimes, I want to say this in the context of this talk I want to give to you this afternoon, there's usually 4 elements of power that define a nation, that give it its ability to have national power. And those critical elements are diplomatic, economic, military, and informational, excuse me. Those are the 4 elements that are considered to give a nation power around the world. And I can assure you that there's 2 other elements that need to come into that, and that is energy and food. Because if we are restricted on either one of those 2, the chances of us being a global power will be diminished quickly. So in the context of this talk this afternoon, I want to talk about food security and our national security, talk about some of the challenges, but I will share with you this. Even though there's going to be some times I get pretty dark in my comments, the reality is there are so many opportunities that exist for countries like the United States and young people around the world to play a part in our future food system to meet that growing demand to feed 9 or 10 billion people as we go forward. So when you think of food security, many of you probably thought of food security of maybe doing the backpack lunches for your kids to give out at school for some other children to take home on a weekend. Maybe it was a contribution of $20 to a month for some food security effort around the world with an NGO somewhere. The reality is the World Food Program, an organization that I work with in Rome, Italy, we actually ran the 2nd largest budget in international organizations out of our embassy over the World Food Program and FAO and a number of other organizations. They deliver food around the world to about 140 million people, with another 350 million on the edge of poverty and hunger. So it's a very critical program for us to be involved with, but it's going to have its own challenges as we go forward in the next few years. So food security in the United States has really been a luxury to us. You know, I'll go over some of our history and time of how we've dealt with this, but we've taken it for granted as we have energy at the same time. This next slide depicts a map the World Food Program puts out. It's updated daily. But you can see places around the world that are food insecure. I spent time in Bangladesh, where I saw at Cox's Bazar maybe about 1 million people in an internment camp that were feeding there on a daily basis. I moved on into through Pakistan, time in Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, coming into the Horn of Africa. Recently, I was just in Sudan. I led a group of CEOs there to look at, see what are the opportunities for Sudan to play a role in the global food system. They've got the land, they've got the resources, the water, the ports. They could be a player of feeding the people in their own nation and around the continent of Africa. Right now, the World Food Program spends about $3 billion there every 4 years. No one wants to live on that. My job was to go there and show people how to farm, make sure that these organizations were enabled to create resilience and capacity in food systems around the world. So when you look at that map, you look at that and you say, what's it take to feed those people around the world? Well, last year, the World Food Program spent about $14 billion on food aid around the world. Typically, they dealt in places around the world where they experienced a tsunami, a hurricane, earthquake, drought, whatever it might be. That's what they were intended to do. Now, 70% of the places they deliver food aid around the world are in the midst of man-made conflict. Totally man-made hunger around the world. And this is where we really need to work on that as much as anything to see if we can do something to eliminate some of that geopolitical risk. You know, I've been in Ukraine twice since last fall. And I can tell you the role that the Ukraine plays in feeding Egypt and through the Sahel and the Horn of Africa, throughout the Middle East. And it's easy for us to go to bed at night or have our 3-round meals and think everything's fine, but there's a lot of places around the world and it brings a lot of geopolitical risk to it. As Vladimir Lenin said, excuse me, I skipped one here, you can see that there's been foodborne crises around the world. It's happened many times. In fact, it's mentioned in the Bible hundreds of times before Christ. But you can see in recent history, you know, we had the French Revolution, we had the Russian Revolution, we had Arab Spring. Most recently, we had what happened in Sri Lanka when they made a change to go completely organic in their food system. Nothing wrong with organic, but you can't do it all that way. So it overturns governments. It changes lives for so many people. And this is where we really need to play a role. You know, Vladimir Lenin said, every society is 3 meals away from chaos. Now, we just had a great meal here at noon today. You had some beef there, probably came from somewhere in the Midwest. It was fed corn and soybeans, or maybe it was grass-fed. You had lettuce that probably came from the Central Valley in California. You had oil that may have came from somewhere in the northern plains that complemented the salad. You had vegetables that probably came from somewhere in Nogales or somewhere in South Texas. So our food supply chains are very complex, but they meet our needs. But the reality is in the United States, we eat for about 11% of our disposable income. 11%. That's a long way from where it used to be, and we take it for granted. So as I said earlier, national power enables a nation to maintain national security. This is where I feel it's not only energy, it's food plays a critical role in that. Imagine all of a sudden if our food supply got cut off. I thought about that this last year. We've totally globalized our supply chains over the last 50 years, and agriculture is one of those. It's been outsourcing its building blocks to produce food, fiber, and energy. Fertilizer comes from Russia. Some comes from China. Our chemistries come from China. There's a lot of it that comes from around the world, and we could be choked off at any one point in time. So that national security is a threat that we all need to pay close attention to. When I think of the foundations of U.S. food security in the United States, I think about what makes us such a great nation in food security? The best waterways. We've got nearly 14,000 miles of navigable, connected waterways in the United States that flow south. And we can move freight, we can move products year in, year out, throughout the year. It's also connected with some of the best land in the world. We've got one of the largest contiguous tracts of productive farmland where it gets cold enough to kill the vectors that can inhibit the ability to produce the yields that we need. It also is warm enough we can produce a crop. So the U.S. is a special place in food production around the world that most places can't even come close to. And we have the right people. We have a very skilled population. We've had, as we heard, the School of Agriculture and Extension Service here in Alaska. We do so much to educate the young people coming up that will come out to our farms or maybe be a scientist somewhere or a geneticist or a digital scientist that can make improved productivity on our farm. And then we have uninterrupted cultivation because of our borders, not only with Canada, but with the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific. So the United States is a special place, and we continue to remain that power. If we look back in time, you look back at the Great Depression, we weren't immune from hunger. In 1928, 1930, when we had the Dust Bowl, it wasn't an issue of there wasn't enough food in the United States. The issue was there was enough food, but we didn't have interstate systems. We didn't have packaging, processing, manufacturing. We didn't have a way to get it to the consumer. And so food prices were high, and people starved during the Depression. Starved. That happened here in our own country. It's hard to believe. You go back not quite 100 years ago, and that occurred. You know, if we continue to work up through the future, and we look at, you know, what went on during that time frame, we started to embrace change. We started building up the infrastructure in our country to make sure that we could feed the people. The last time we were food insecure in this country, where we had actually allocations where the shoppers back in the late 1930s and 1940s would have been during World War II, where you went to the store and you were only allowed to buy certain products. Well, no one in this room remembers that, I guarantee it, because, you know, if we're talking back in the 30s and 40s, they're not around anymore. Many of them aren't. So this is the last time that's happened in the United States, so we tend to forget it. But when you look at productivity, if you look at that top line or that blue line, that's what the United States did during that time frame. We increased productivity. People moved off the farm. We had the Extension Service started. We started to produce food at scale and process and manufacture and distribute. And all of a sudden, prices started to come down, and the United States remained a leader in that global food system, that supply chain. So if we move on, remember some of those speeches John Kennedy made and the changes, the Cuban crisis, and some of the things that went on during Eisenhower's time frame. But when we look at that productivity, we'll look at the numbers of farms in the United States, you can see that the number of farms went down. People moved off the farm to get another professional careers. But at the same time, if you look at that chart, it continues its upward trend in productivity. You know, I go back to my father's generation. My father passed a year ago in February at 93. He ran through the finish line. But we've increased yields 5x what he used to produce when he was young, when we first started. So you can see it's innovation, it's technologies, it's investments in our educational system that has allowed us to do that. So we've created an American success, but that success has gotten us to the point where we're now vulnerable because we take food for granted. And that's where we're at risk today. So as we have the privilege of land, people, and the Cold War success, we've lost our national security approach to food. We are under threat right now, but it's not too late. We can make a difference. So what are our vulnerabilities? You can see what they are here, but when I look into the room and I turn on the light, and all of a sudden that light, what turned that on was COVID. The Ukrainian war turned this on. We understood all of a sudden about supply chain, labor, our immigrants, policy, global trade, regulations. Those are vulnerabilities that will change our ability to feed a growing population. So let's look at policy first. Population growth. As we continue to evolve as a nation, 250 years old almost. Yeah, I'll take some water. as we continue to grow as a nation, we've moved into urban areas. This isn't a phenomenon unique to the United States. This has happened everywhere around the world. Thank you. Ellie, I should have been drinking more of your urban remedy. Now we're talking about urban populations. We've moved into these areas around the country, live in the fringe. Nearly 2 out of 3 people live closer to the borders of the United States. So as you look at that, you can see we continue to migrate, but you look at this rapid urbanization, with 64%, just think of that. That's, 70-some years ago, we went to 79% in 2000, and we're quickly on the pathway to be at 89% living in urban areas by the year 2050. Now, that make a lot of sense to us a lot, people in a confined area, close to services and products and everything they need to conduct life and their jobs and roles and everything. But at the same time, it's created an environment where now people are no longer connected with where their food comes from. I grew up in a rural community where everybody knew everybody, and everybody was probably a farmer connected to a farmer. And when someone got out of farming, his kids came and worked on your farm, or yours went and worked on his farm. Today, when you talk into an urban audience, you don't talk to anyone any longer. It says, yeah, my granddad had a farm, or my dad had a farm, or my great-granddad had a farm. We're so disconnected from that. And it's really presenting a challenge to the industry that's really having an impact. Now, in fact, if you look at congressional districts around the United States, only 8% of our members of the U.S. Congress are now from rural areas. That's a challenge, and we're not having the representation that we typically need. Another challenge we face is this: 175 acres an hour of U.S. range and pasture and farmland is being lost. Now, some of this is going into solar panels, some of it's going into roads, industrial development, whatever it may be, but the reality is that's a lot of land to be losing. And that's 31 million since the late 80s. So we look at regulatory. Regulatory has its own challenges. When we think about this, it's probably the 70s when we had some oil spills and some things going on in different parts of the country where we really created an atmosphere where we all of a sudden said, you know what, we probably should be regulating the chemical industry or the oil industry or whatever it is that had a threat to the environment. And a lot of people ignored that. They didn't think it was going to go much further. They thought, the EPA is going to be around for a little while and it's going to go away. But the reality is it was good. We needed that regulatory agency. We want to be scrutinized. We want to make sure the products that come out that we use on our farms and you use on your households or in your yards or whatever it may be is safe. But we want to make sure the air and the water and soil we walk on is safe for not only our generation, but future generations. But it's gotten to the point where it's getting so big that the oversight now is really restricting our ability to innovate. For instance, I had a meeting at the EPA here just about a month ago. We met with some Endangered Species Preservation Act enforcers, and one of the topics we had is if there's a new molecule comes out, and it could be a bio, it could be synthetic, that we need to control a pest on our farm, a weed, an insect, whatever it may be, that timeline to get that introduced is usually 17 years and hundreds of millions of dollars to get it approved. Now, granted, they're bringing a lot safer products to the marketplace than what we used to, but they're losing the interest in bringing these new products. And I can guarantee you it's a biological process. Insects, weeds, and everything else is going to grow resistance against the products we're using today, whether it's biological or synthetic. So this agency has gotten to the point it's really slowed us down to bringing the innovations we need to come to the marketplace, which will in turn increases the price of food and affect those that can least afford it the most. This is one thing we need to really understand. Whether it's food or energy, we got to be careful in our policies that they don't have an impact on the price to the consumer that's beyond their reach. No one wants to do that. Thank you. For the most part, agriculture has been immune from that until probably in the 80s and 90s. No one really worried too much about what went on the farms. But as the agencies grew bigger, they started paying a little closer attention. I can assure you of this. I'm a family farmer. Only first time in my life I moved away from the farm to serve as the ambassador in Rome for a few years. But I've been there my entire life. Our family came to the United States in the late 1600s. We fought in the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, and in the Middle East. Our family survived the Depression, the Dust Bowl. We survived the 1980 farm crisis. We are stewards of the land. We want to take good care of the land that God has given us, and there is no other industry in the world that transfers a business to the next generation more than agriculture and the family farmers in the United States of America. And I'm really proud to be one of those. And I can tell you, I assure you, we will take care of the environment and everything, resources we have. Thank you. You know, but today we have 4 out of 10 people claim themselves as environmentalists. I claim myself as an environmentalist. That isn't reserved for somebody that has a different leaning opinion in that. I want to take care of the environment too, so I am an environmentalist as well, but not maybe in your traditional terms. But people really are paying a lot more attention to the way that we operate our farms, the products we use on our farms. How many of you go to the store and before you buy a product, you look back at the label and you see where it came from, what's in it, is it GMO, non-GMO, has it got salt, does it, what are all the ingredients? People pay a lot closer attention to their food supply, even though it's only costing them 11% of what they used to pay for it, or 11% of their disposable income, whereas back in the Dust Bowl it was 40%. So as we consider ourselves environmentalists, we want to make sure that we're creating the policy that really does have a positive impact on the U.S. consumers and those around the world. As I said, around the world, we feed a lot of people around the world. The United States does. And if people aren't food secure, they end up migrating. When they migrate, they get caught up in human trafficking, 1 to 30 million people a year. They get caught up in illicit drug trade or arms movement. And worst case, they get involved in terrorist activities. We experienced that on 9/11. So it's beholden upon us to make sure that we have a food secure world. You know, the consumer revolution continues to move too. Many of you have seen this yourselves firsthand, but it really requires a lot of changes. You know, for instance, we had Proposition 12 in California pass. It's an Animal Husbandry Act that was approved in California, went to the Supreme Court, was ruled on about a week and a half ago. There's probably going to be some challenges from it from the USDA, but people are really more concerned about how the animals are treated, as they should be. No one wants to take care of their flocks, their herds, their fields, their streams, their rivers, their creeks and lakes or bogs than a farmer does. And the animals are every bit a part of that. So there's some challenges that come along and some of the transparency issues that are out there. We want to be transparent about things, but we want to make sure we have an educated consumer as well. Ronald Reagan was one of the greatest. He started this biotechnology regulations and signed it, and it gave us the framework to bring new products to the marketplace. Without that, I can guarantee you our carbon footprint would be higher, our productivity would be lower, and there would be more people around the world involved in migrating, trying to find another place to live or conduct the activities that I mentioned earlier. You know, when you look at climate change, you look at what really resonates with consumers. Climate's a big deal, and if you're a corporation and you're not acting properly in protecting the climate, that's probably one of the highest areas of risk that they see themselves being sued from. So we need to make sure that we're supporting the corporations to make sure they have the right tools, and we as suppliers to some of those corporations, whether it's somebody that provides a product to McDonald's or whether it's somebody that feeds something into P&G or any one of the companies. We want to make sure, and we are doing a lot of it today through our digital technologies, some mapping out the productivity on our farm and what is our index in carbon and everything. So it's critical that we support these efforts and these companies that are working on our food supply. Something that really resonates, this is just an impact chart, but it shows you what really resonates with the consumers and how their buying habits are influenced by certain labeling restrictions. So this is how the consumer's changing, but a lot of those, if you look at that column there and everything that's listed there, do they really know what they're looking for when they pick out, for instance, they want to put in non-GMOs? Non-GMOs are They're still there. They're going to be produced for a long time. But gene editing is probably the newest natural form of improving genetics. And that's coming along too, but it's getting increased scrutiny as well. But we have to have these tools if we're going to continue to leverage the resources that we have to feed that world. You know, I get into these discussions with the Europeans quite frequently, and one of their comments is, we need to go completely organic. Okay, let's do the math. All of a sudden you start looking at your production of all these different products, whether it's lettuce or whether it's corn, and you see that productivity drop. What's the price do? What's availability to the world's consumers do? And if you have to do that, if you have to produce it on a broader scale of land, where do you go? Do you go to the rainforest? No. There's no more land. You saw what I showed, how much we're losing in the United States. So it's the innovation that gives us the ability to use the limited resources we have to feed that world. You know, this is a sample on gene biotech and some of that. You know, we should be more focused on the outcomes and not the methods. I can produce a GMO corn. I don't use a chemistry on to control an insect that can reduce yields 20–30%. I can use a cheaper chemistry to kill the weeds. It's one of the safest ones in the marketplace. And I can reduce my carbon footprint by 18% because my productivity gains. I can also decrease my use of fertilizer and other chemistries and the fuel to produce that crop. So we really need to take a holistic view of agriculture when we go to form this policy and make sure that we're doing it in the right manner. And this is a case on cattle. This is one on grain. This is on wheat here. Wheat is being something that's consumed directly by consumers through the pasta you had today or the bread you might have picked up out there. They're making sure these products are safe, but now they're finally coming to the marketplace because there's been no new genetics in wheat for a long time, and a lot of the world survives on wheat. So it's important to have that. Trade-wise, here's a challenge we have faced right now. Mexico, they've been overrun by the Europeans on trying to promote their European Green Deal Farm to Fork initiative. They've spent a lot of time in Mexico talking to them about getting glyphosate out of the market, but more importantly, don't import GMO corn from the United States. Well, you can see what it's going to do to the price of a tortilla shell. Just that one. I mean, the impact is great, but we have left our guard down. We assume that these relationships are going to remain strong. So there's a lot of things moving around the world that we need to be involved with. When we look at regulation around the world, this chart isn't going to be that important to you, but you know, when you look at Africa, do you think they're worried about regulation? They're eating for $2 a day. Do you think they're worried about going to Starbucks and spending $8 on a cafe latte, Supreme, whatever they all are anymore? No, they're not. They're feeding themselves on $2 a day. May only make $3 a day. They have to decide which child eats today, which child doesn't eat today. And that's something we're going to face in the coming years here more than we've ever experienced. I talk about that a lot, but you know, we spent $14 billion in the World Food Program last year. This year we expect it to be $5 billion. $5 billion. Now, can you imagine if your food budget at your house got cut almost in a third? Someone's going to suffer. And so this is where we need to create resilience and capacity in food systems and bring innovation to those around the world that need it. That's one of the reasons we went to Sudan. We quickly understood that the UN is not going to solve these problems, the Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Food Program. It's going to come down to the private sector getting involved, bringing in innovation, bringing in capital, bringing in education to try to get involved. And that's why we're doing the things we're doing in Sudan before they had a coup occur here a few months ago. But we're doing it in other places like Kenya, Tanzania, and moving around the world at the same time. So there are opportunities out there. When we consider the legal, obviously, you know, we can all recall what goes on with this. We know that on a daily basis, you pick up or you're watching the TV, there's some tort action reform or class action suit against someone that's produced a chemical or someone that's produced, drank the water, Camp Lejeune, whatever it may be. Some of them legitimate, some maybe not. But it has really created an influence of these organizations that they chip in with each other to make things work, and they leave a breadcrumb trail of how they got so far they did in that past suit for the next ones to pick up on. And these attacks take many forms, and there seems like there's a new one gets emerged almost daily anymore. through these real quick. This is a little bit on the strength in our dependency, as I spoke a little bit earlier about. If we just look at building blocks for producing crops, you can't get away from them. I mean, believe me, we test hundreds of different biological products every year. We use natural resources from livestock operations and others, but you can't get away from using these basic elements of potash, nitrogen, and phosphorus. If you do, you suffer in productivity. So, but you look at this chart, you can see real quickly there that we're beholden to a lot of other nations. China, Russia. Last year, we were importing in the United States, we were importing nitrogen from Russia. We were importing nitrogen from Russia until almost January, till the banking system finally caught up with it and shut it down. We wouldn't conduct the transactions. I guarantee you there's farms in the United States that's planting a crop, that's growing that crop right now, that are using Russian nitrogen. Do I feel good about that? Hell no, I don't, because I funded the war for Putin. And this is why we need to bring these supply chains back home. When I look at China, they shut off their phosphorus supplies to a lot of places around the world. They're one of the larger suppliers of phosphorus. We produce phosphorus here, but it's waning right now because of the regulatory environment about producing phosphorus in the United States. So we're going offshore. Yet we have what's called, and the governor and I was talking about this earlier, called the Jones Act. I don't know how many are familiar with it, but anytime a vessel is in open water going from port to port on U.S. ports, one to another, you're going to pay into the Jones Act. You're going to pay a higher freight rate to get it there. Right now, I could bring phosphorus in from OCP, that's a company in Morocco, off the coast of Africa, up the Mississippi River, and to my farm for a third less than I can get phosphorus from North Florida. That's the damage that policy does in our ability to feed ourselves. So if you look at these rare earth elements, we had discussions earlier from Ambassador Manuel and others that spoke today. We've got to bring these supply chains back home. I had a conversation with Ambassador Lighthouser at the Trade Office a few weeks ago in Fort Worth, and that's one of the big agenda items he's got going. So when you look in the U.S., and you've all been watching the news, it seemed like it happened after the spy balloon flew over the United States, but all of a sudden we started to focus on China. They're owning U.S. farmland. Yeah, that's going on. There's no question about it. I had a meeting with some people from Syngenta a while back here. They called up and they said, can you do anything to help us with this? We lease land. We buy land in the United States to run research trials. If you don't know, Syngenta was a Swiss-based company bought by China Corp, or Chinachem. They're trying to do an IPO right now, but they're buying U.S. soil. And I talked to the CEO and I said, no, I don't think it should happen here. But it goes far beyond companies like Syngenta. It's Smithfield. Smithfield is the largest pork processor in the United States, producer. 2,100 family farms produce hogs for Smithfield. Do you think the Chinese bought Smithfield for their pork production capacity? No, they did not. They bought it for their systems approach to production of pork. They want to know how we produce pork in the United States. Why are we so successful? Our rations are competitive. Our cost of per unit cost is low. How do you get the consumer? They actually know all the way to the consumer through the different systems and different retail of who's buying what pork. That goes on into Smithfield. So that's a big deal. CGB is a grain trading company, a lot of value-add products. We've dealt with them too, not any longer, but it's about investing in U.S. technologies. Everybody wants, as we heard earlier today, everybody wants to be the United States. Everybody wants what we have. And it's no different with the Chinese. When we look at brick control, this is something that's really concerning. When you look at the bricks, there is no doubt there is a change in play today. You'll see a chart here soon, but I know I just spoke recently in Geneva, Switzerland at a grain traders conference on the Black Sea. And I can tell you that there's a lot of changes in movement from grain, not now coming from the United States. We've seen our exports drop almost $25 billion since the beginning of the year on grains. It's now coming out of Brazil. It's going into China. China's trading it in yuans, not US dollar, the reserve currency, but in yuans. That's a risk. That's something we got to pay close attention to. But you can see potash, phosphorus, and the nitrogen products there and brick control. And you can see in the center of that chart there's the ships coming off the port of Santos and other places in Brazil, moving on into Asia, most of it into China. They want to displace the United States in being their lead supplier of a lot of these commodities. In fact, I made a comment here a while back that I could see a point in time where we're not being an exporter of raw commodities anymore, corn and soybeans, wheat, things like that, sorghum. We're going to have to add value to it. And this is where the United States needs to start doing more on added value and moving added value product around the world. But these two guys right here, Xi and Putin, I can tell you what, they're not after our best interests, that's for certain. Chinese interest investment in Africa. I can tell you I was in 22 some countries in Africa during my short term of service. And I can tell you that the Chinese are playing a major role in every nation I was to in Africa. We had one organization under our control in Rome called International Development Law Organization. I tuned them into Africa and trying to help some of these countries unravel themselves from some of the death spirals created by the Chinese Communist Party. And I can tell you I had to leave, but they're still working on it today. But there's a lot of influence. They want the resources. It's not just agriculture, it's mining materials and all the other elements that Africa has to offer to it. So you can see the investments in Africa have been huge by the Chinese. This is very purposeful. When we look at labor, just a few years ago, we failed to plant about 6 million acres of crops. Why? Because we didn't have the labor to harvest them. We're in serious need of cracking down on illegal immigrants, but making sure our immigration policy works too at the same time to allow workers to come in. I don't know how many of you have done this, but I've been into Mexico and I came across the border. I walked with people coming in to work to harvest in Nogales, and you want an eye-opening experience, go to Mexico, walk across the line of these people going through immigrations to come and work for one day and then walk back home 5-6 miles. We'd be lost without these people. If we don't have these people picking produce in the United States to feed the American people or those around the world, we're going to be growing it in another country and it's still going to be picked by foreign labor. So we need to make sure we can figure out this immigration policy to create these jobs, to allow the flow in, to do the work that needs to be done. Because quite frankly, farms like ours, we employ typically in the summer months somewhere around 800 people just to pick tassels off corn. Do the math. I mean, it's not, just a portion of our crop we have to detassel, but let's say it's 10,000 acres and there's 40,000 plants in an acre. That's a lot of tassels to pull. So it takes a lot of labor. We're running out of labor. We can't get it done anymore. So we went to genetics and we went to mechanical means to get it done because you can't find Americans to work. At one time, we employed over 1,100 kids from high schools within an area working on our farm. And you got to talk about daycare facility. That's what I had going on then. But it was that real exercise in futility. So if you look at autonomy and labor solutions in agriculture, if we're going to try to replace some of that workforce and labor, I can tell you we're making progress, but it's not fast enough. I know Ellie's got some investments probably in this space. Farms like ours where we used an autonomous tractor to planting a portion of the crop. There's no one in the cab. It's running by itself. There's still a lot of hurdles to overcome, but we've got to figure this out. So whether it's vegetables, fruits, planting of crops, or in a packing house somewhere, I think everybody had a wake-up call during COVID because they lost their workforce, they couldn't get things done, and all of a sudden when you went to the store, not so much on the tissue paper, but on pork products or beef products, something that had to be processed where workers couldn't get into the plant, you ran out of food. It wasn't there. So we've got to figure this out on autonomy and labor solutions. Again, you can see the growth and people get involved in picking our crops here. Supply chain, I'm going to get through this really quick here because I want to move on. But you look at what happened in the United States following World War II. The work that Eisenhower did on the interstate highway system, the money that went, the purpose that people had in the United States. Our soldiers came back, the 9 million people we had serving around the world during World War II came back and went to work. We had purpose. We built the Hoover Dam in record time. We built LaGuardia Airport. We built the Bay Bridge. We got things done back then because we knew it was the best for the United States of America. So today we're in a little different place. Back then we're maybe 125, 130 million people. Today we're 335 million, I believe it is now in the United States. that number continues to grow. But we've got infrastructure in most cases that doesn't allow us to grow to where we need to be and have that strong economy and those national powers I referred to earlier. And while we're talking infrastructure, you look at, we need to spend almost $2.6 trillion. This is a couple years old, so that 2.6 is probably much greater today. But up until 1939, we're going to lose $10 trillion in lost GDP. Now, I can tell you, if we're not spending it, the Chinese are spending it. They're doing the Belt and Road Initiative. They've got a lot of efforts going around the world, and again, they want to supplant us. So this is a real opportunity for the United States with those rivers and systems we have and the ports we have around the United States, our productivity, where we can really have an impact. And this is, again, an opportunity for Americans to really ramp it up. Here's just a quick chart. I don't know if you got it in your carryouts or your programs in front of it, but you can see our infrastructure is barely getting a passing grade. And that doesn't matter whether it's airports, sewers, water, rail, anything. We need to invest, and it needs to be in infrastructure, not called an infrastructure bill, but actually invested in infrastructure. When you look at connectivity, this is where we're not shining very well. Liner shipping connectivity. I'm talking containers. China's got us in a big way. China is really moving containers around the world at high rates, high volumes to move their products around the world, and we are miserably behind them on that. It used to be we considered the global waters pretty safe for the world. The U.S. kind of policed it at one point in time. Just in the last month and a half here, we've had 2 oil freighters bound for the United States seized by Iranians. What's going on with that? We're losing our leadership. We need to make sure that we can enforce and protect the vessels as they move around the world, whether it's critical resources like energy or food or fuel, whatever it may be. We need to make sure we have safe waters. And by the way, when you look at this map, I don't know if you can see it here, it's on the next slide, but no, it's that one there. It's, there's a lot of choke points around the world. And China's figured this out very well with Brazil as an example, with Russia. But when you look, about 48% of the world's grain and food products go through a choke point somewhere where it could be shut off. Everybody remembers what happened in the Suez Canal just, a year or so ago. We had the one ship that got on land and went sideways and blocked it for quite some time, and some ships had to go around the Horn of Africa to get to their destination. So we've got to pay close attention to this. So as we look at our economy, as I said, in 1933 or a little bit later than that, we're 125, 130 million people, and we're not keeping pace in terms of making sure that we have the ability to move food around the world in the manner we need to with our infrastructure. So what are our contingency plans? When we look at our globalized supply chains, we've all went digital. Our farm's all digital. I mean, we don't make a decision without somebody in an office somewhere, a scientist somewhere, writing an algorithm for us that helps us seed the crop, fertilize the crop, spray the weeds, whatever it may be. Our banking, our commodity marketing, everything else. But when I look at these supply chains, I look at what happened to JBS, and we'll see it in just a little bit here. Everybody has digitized their system, and that makes us vulnerable. It increases productivity, but it makes us vulnerable. And then you look at consolidation, whether it's in a grocery retail, whether it's in the production of protein by JBS or one of the larger protein processors. These are critical vulnerability points where we need to make sure that we not only have large producers, but we have small and medium-sized ones as well to make sure we're resilient. You know, this is too important to fail. This is JBS. They shut down for quite some time because their system was hacked. JBS is owned by a couple Brazilian brothers, the largest beef processor in the world. All of a sudden, beef supply chains got cut off. When you look at this map, it's how avian influenza is a real issue for the United States. Everybody's seen what the price of eggs have done in the last 6-7 months. Eggs are in a lot of different products, and avian flu is a big problem. It can be carried by mallards, it can be carried by Canadian geese. They land into an open lot that's got chickens in it, and they can transfer the disease, and they're dead. Or you can even have confined ones that can maybe even pick up on it. So a lot of the herd was culled, or flocks were culled to a certain extent, and thus, why we had high egg prices. So we're very vulnerable to some of these biological threats as well. When we look at California, we know they have water restrictions. I think there was a pack site yesterday in the Colorado Basin, hopefully supply a little more water into California. But when you look at the salad bowl, as is indicated there, nearly 95% of the salad, like what we had today, came probably from California. And they're a big share of our GDP when it comes to agriculture. So this area is it's extreme risk. And this is why I think you're seeing some of these other systems come into play. I know Ellie's involved with some, I've been involved with some, but we're bringing CEIs, controlled environment agriculture, back into the East Coast, get them closer to the consumer centers and get that product there where it's delivered in a short period of time, takes less water, takes less fuel, has a better carbon footprint, and we get to the consumer in a quicker manner. You look at our response times to natural disasters like Katrina. We saw the displacement during Katrina when that happened. What's that been, 15 years ago now? 20 almost. But these are four major critical dependencies that we have, and these are things we need to pay close attention to. But these are primary vulnerabilities, and again, when we look at distribution networks, and we look at the China Belts and Road Initiative, that's one that really probably scares me more than anything, and this map doesn't show it, but they're all across South America and many other places. And I can tell you, working in the UN system with the Chinese director of the Food and Agriculture Organization, they will do anything to make sure policy goes in their direction to make sure they continue their initiatives on the Belts and Road Initiative, and will be using as their connectivity to feed the Chinese Communist Party. Global trade, we're going to wrap up here soon here. China, you can see up until 22, we were doing pretty good with China on trade. We're up nearly 20% when we look at ag trade. This year, we're down about 20%. Now, I'm not going to blame this on any administration or anything like that. This is just a long-term play that the Chinese have had. But we do need to continue to promote U.S. products, goods, and services around the world, or we're going to become an increased threat in losing some of those markets. This is a Chinese complex for feeding hogs. Basically, they start out with the farrowing at the top, and they move the sow or the pig that's going into meat down through the building. They got their own feed processing, their own veterinary clinics, everything. But you can see the Chinese are on a diet. They want to consume what we consume, and this is their way to do it. And that's why they've had such an insatiable appetite for U.S. grains and commodities, and now Brazilian. So this isn't anything I see is changing soon. I think Xi's figured it out. He's got to keep his people well fed and give them the diet that they want. This just shows exports. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this. Ukraine, as I said, I was there a number of times. This is something I don't see changing anytime real soon. There's large pipelines that Russia wants to get fertilizer out through Odessa and Mykolaiv. I spent some time in Kherson, up on the front line with Zaporizhia, Kyiv, came in through Romania. But I can tell you the Black Sea is always going to be treacherous. The Turks are charging enormous tax rates for those ships to go through, even though they're humanitarian ships. And so I had a group in, we're actually at a Berkshire Hathaway company last week called CTB, looking at a nearly $2 billion project to be able to move some of these grains out of Ukraine once things stabilize, move them west towards Europe so they're not falling prey to the Russians and what they're doing in the Black Sea. One final note on the Black Sea is this conference in Geneva. This is extremely unusual. Most grain trading goes on between companies, but now we're starting to notice, for instance, Iran paid $20,000 to meet with a bunch of the group of the people who were at this convention in Geneva, and their concern is they are now taking over their purchases and who they're dealing with around the world, but they want to pay for it in yuans, but they don't have enough. So you tell me how that works out in these relationships with Xi and China and Russia as well. So the world is changing fast on some of this grain trading. These are just some future state assumptions that we need to consider as we look at the risk. And some of the wild cards are here as listed. But as I said earlier, American food power, it's no different than energy power. We need to make sure that we continue to invest in U.S. agriculture, innovations. We need to onshore supply chains. And we need to make sure that Alaska is playing a big part in that role as well. When you start talking to consumers, you can tell they're picking up on this as well. They're concerned. When they went through the supply chains of the grocery store back in 2020 and 2021, when they couldn't get the products they needed, they're concerned. And now, with the increases in food prices we're seeing consumers making some shifts in their behaviors and what they buy. You know, they might have bought a branded product before, now they buy a store brand, or maybe they even cut it clear out and buy something cheaper. So there's a lot of concern from the consumer right now, and they're really uneasy with where our food system's at. This is nothing that you haven't all seen before, this inflation price index, and you can see we're finally moving lower on that. So instruments of national power, as I said, is diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. But I believe food will play a major part in that, as will energy, because the two go together. We need to make sure we continue to promote American food and energy. So when we look at the means to produce more than we need, these are the elements that we have in front of us that we need to work with. So these are our vulnerabilities. We talked about them all, but these are some policy changes we need to make sure. We don't have any ag food policy that really focuses on increasing productivity and using food security as national security, and it's time we do that. It's been an honor to be with you today. I look forward to the rest of the conversations this afternoon and tomorrow as well. Thank you.